welcome to today's interview with Paul Richardson. My name is Mike McMahon, and I am the Executive Director of the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada, and I'm really looking forward to this next hour or so with Paul. So glad that you're with us, and if you would like to participate in the conversation, we can't see you or hear you, but you can write in the chat, and we'll be watching that as we go through this time. Or you can put a question in the Q&A, but I think it'd be better if you actually use the chat. We'll be watching that a little more closely. It's nice to see a good group of you here today, and I know many of you know Paul personally, and hopefully you'll get to know him a little better during this next hour. If you don't know Paul, he is a highly respected hymnologist, church musician, teacher, author, and hymn writer. And prior to his retirement, he served as professor and assistant dean for graduate studies in the School of Music of Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, where he taught voice and church music. He's a past president of the Hymn Society in the United States and Canada, and he has recently completed a history of the Hymn Society, which is going to be published soon, as sort of the capstone to our 100th anniversary celebration. And he's actually written a lot of stuff, and with other people. So welcome, Paul. It's great to see you and talk to you today.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be with you and to see folks signing in from near and far.
Indeed. That's one of the beauties of these events, is bringing people together. You know, it used to be, I think, that we thought that the Hymn Society convened once a year at the annual conference, but we've been able to bring people together in all kinds of other ways, which is great. And I'm glad that this opportunity presents itself today to talk with you. I'd love to start by asking you about how this all began for you, how in your family and your upbringing you came to be interested in music and church ministry.
Well, I grew up with way too much supervision. I had, in effect, three parents: my father, a pharmacist, my mother, a school teacher, and my grandmother, a piano teacher who lived with us. In addition, I have two older brothers, and all of the people I just mentioned I lived with made music in church. My grandmother had been a church musician and a pastor's wife. My father sang not only in those settings growing up, but sang in college quartets, which was how they made music in those days, at three different institutions he attended. My mother, though not a music major, took music in college and was an accomplished pianist. My older brother, who became a seminary professor and then a chaplain educator, loved music, participated in choirs, and studied voice at the various institutions he attended. And then my brother James, who some Hymn Society folk will know, was a church musician for his whole career. He's one of the few people who can claim to be a member of the society longer than I have.
Wow, that's quite impressive family. So what kind of music did you do when you were young?
Well, I took piano from the grandmother who lived with us until the relationship got in the way of the obedience. So I stopped for a few years. I was in choirs and took voice with Margaret Witt, who was a musician in our church. And I want to pay special tribute to her and say a little bit about her. She had been to college and became a church musician, and then had married a veterinarian who came to the rural area where I lived to practice. The church never paid her a penny, so far as I know, but she often had as many as 6 or 7 choirs in this little county seat congregation of 300 people. And that was a gift because there was no music in the public schools. So that was my vocal and choral training. And then I was very fortunate in high school, as I began to consider going to college to study music, to study piano with Ruth Rowell, who was herself a musician and a seminary graduate.
Huh. Interesting. Now, you've made great contributions to the Baptist world, and I'm just wondering, I assume that you grew up in the Baptist tradition, yes?
I did. I did. My grandfather, who I never knew, was a second career pastor. Uh, we're not sure, but we think he was a nominal Lutheran or Methodist, which tells you something about how nominal he was, until our grandmother called him to be a Baptist minister. And that's how he got into ministry, went to seminary, and then served churches in a few small towns, including the one in which I grew up.
Which was where?
This is Stuart, Virginia, named for General James Ewell Brown Stuart, the eyes and ears of the Confederacy. It's a county seat town about an hour north of Winston-Salem, about an hour south of Roanoke.
Oh, okay. Cool. Now, you mentioned that you went on to study music in college, and can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, I went to Mars Hill College, where I swore I would never go. My parents had met there, both my brothers had been there, and I wasn't having any of it. But I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had been admitted to Wake Forest in a pre-law program and to Michigan State in a social science program, and to Mars Hill with a music scholarship. And I decided I would go do that till I figured out what I wanted to do. And I managed to get to retirement without figuring out what I actually wanted to
do. Right. That's a long journey.
Oh.
Yeah. And so you studied music there, and how did you make then? Were you connected to church music at all during that period as well?
Yes, I was a double major in church music and vocal performance. And I sang the first year at All Souls Episcopal in Asheville, where Bob Rich, our college choir director, was leading the music on an interim basis until they hired Marilyn Kaiser, and that's where I met Marilyn. Then for my last 3 years, I was the minister of music at the First Baptist Church in Burnsville, North Carolina, a county seat town about 30 miles from the college. And I had a wonderful experience there. Those people were very kind and very tolerant, and that helped clarify my vocational direction.
Uh-huh. And so from college, how did that unfold?
Well, I went directly from college to Southern Baptist Seminary. I considered some other programs I was particularly interested in conducting, but I also felt a sense of call, not very clear. And so I went to Southern Seminary, studied there with a number of folks society people would know, Hugh McElrath, Don Hustad, had a number of other fine teachers. And I made friends there with people who had been important through my life. And I will name 3 of them to represent the many others, Ken Wilson and Deb Loftus and Michael Hahn.
Now, just for this parentheses here, I'm not sure that everyone watching right now knows that all 4 of you are living in retirement in the same city and see each other quite frequently, huh?
We are. We think there was a conspiracy to keep us where it was easy for 1 or 2 people to watch us.
Well, I had the experience of coming down to Richmond and sort of being part of that gathering, and it's a pretty powerful group of people with a common background. Well, of course, we've had interviews with both Michael and Deb as part of this series, and they both have spoken about the influence of Hugh McElrath, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Hugh was a very strong influence musically and ministerially, and certainly in the area of hymnology. Hugh's undergraduate degree was in English, and he had a great appreciation for the language. He had come to Southern Seminary in the very first class when it started a School of Church Music, and stayed there, completed a doctorate at Eastman, and taught there for about 5 decades. I'm not sure exactly when he became connected with the Hymn Society, but he definitely believed in its purpose and its community. And so he strongly urged those of us who were going into music ministry as a vocation to become active in the Hymn Society. And it took with a good number of us.
Deb told the story that on the first day of his class, he would go down the aisle and put a card on each desk for people to sign up for the Hymn Society. Did you
Well,
have
the
that?
cards were on the desk when we arrived.
Oh, I see.
Um, it was not pressure, but it was subtle and effective.
Well, in case people can't see your shirt there, yes, there's the Hymn Society logo, and it seems to have stuck.
Well, I wanted to say something about the shirt. This is from the, as you know, from the Brian Hayne collection, which is noted to be flattering to all body types.
Well, it's certainly flattering to you. We're glad to see that. So anyway, back to Southern Seminary. How long were you there, and how did that go?
Well, I was left on the doorstep in a basket as a very young child, and I was there 22 years. I went there to work on a master's degree, stayed to do a doctorate, worked in administration for 4 years while teaching adjunctively, and then was offered a position on the faculty. And I stayed there till 1995.
And what did you teach?
Whatever they needed. My first contract was a 3-year contract to cover sabbaticals. And my colleague Ron Turner referred to me as the silly Freddy professor. Well, who's going to teach? So, Paul can do that. And so Paul did, and he taught things he never took and learned a great deal along the way. But I principally taught musicology and studio voice.
And were you doing any church work at this time?
I did as a student. Susan and I shared a job at Douglas Boulevard Christian Church, which was a very good place for us because the pastor had been an organist as an undergraduate and was very sensitive to hymnological issues. And it allowed Susan and me to share a job, which of course was good. Before she came, I was a year ahead of her in school. I served a Presbyterian church in Southern Indiana. And then once I had graduated, I served a number of churches on part-time or interim basis. I followed Michael Hahn at Crescent Hill Baptist Church, and then served other churches in and around the city.
I know that you said you were at Southern for 22 years. So at some point you made a transition to another place, right? So can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. The dean who hired me at Southern was not the dean who had been there during my education. The older man was Forrest Heron, and he had retired. And the seminary had recruited Milburn Price as dean. Well, for whatever reason, when Milburn had a full-time position there that I spoke of, he offered it to me, and I took it. At the end of that 3-year period, when I was not on tenure track, there was a search for a tenure track position, and I left a trail of breadcrumbs from the meeting room to my office. And anyway, Milburn is responsible for my having that position. When things began to come apart in the Southern Baptist Convention, Milburn moved to Samford University as dean. And 2 years after he went there, he had 2 simultaneous retirements and shaped it so that there was a position for which he wanted me. As one of my colleagues said, it had everything but a height restriction.
So it was sort of tailor-made for you in a way, hey?
It was, and in both places I was supervising graduate work. I was chair of the doctoral studies committee at Southern Seminary for the last few years. And then when I went to Samford, we had master's programs in church music and in music education, and subsequently added those in piano pedagogy and vocal performance.
So I'd be interested to know a little bit about your reflections on the state of education for people entering church music ministry today. I mean, you certainly have had a lot of experience both with shaping programs and shaping students. What's your take?
Well, I have a lot of different takes because the needs and the opportunities are quite varied. It is certainly difficult for any musician to develop the range of skills that many churches assume these days. And I think that's why we see more churches with part-time music staffs made up of someone who's a good organist, someone who's a good choral director, someone who may be a good educator, and someone who's good with praise bands. To the extent that somebody can become competent in all those areas, I think it's wise that they do so. To the extent it's possible to cover all of that in one curriculum, it isn't. So I think the goal is always to prepare good musicians who are good ministers and who are, to the extent they're capable, good teachers and good theologians. Again, that's too much for any one degree.
Right, right. And so how did you deal with that at Samford? I mean, did you encourage people to specialize, or how did you sort of handle that?
Well, at Samford and previously at Southern, we introduced a Master of Divinity in church music degree. Though I did not have that training specifically, I became increasingly persuaded that anyone serving in a congregational setting needs to earn the Master of Divinity degree with the breadth that it brings, and then have the professional specialization alongside that. Unfortunately, in the educational economy that has developed, the trend in degrees is toward shorter MAs, which inevitably leads the individual and the church not as well served.
It seems to me that the trend is also towards shorter MDivs. I've
Yes.
observed that certainly some schools around here. So,
And increasingly non-resident. And I understand the need for that, economic and otherwise, though I think that being in a formative Christian community is an important part of becoming a minister.
yeah.
So we're pulled in lots of different directions.
So at some point during this career, you became pretty deeply involved in the Hymn Society, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you sort of entered into that and got sucked in a little more as time went on.
Well, we can go back to those cards on the desks when you entered the hymnology class. I was interested. I didn't have to be pressured. Then also, my older brother James was already a member of the society. And Tom Smith came to visit Louisville, and that was an influence. Hugh McElrath had Brian Wren there twice, and often had others, both in and out of the Baptist tradition. Mm-hmm. And I first went to a conference in 1983 at Wittenberg. It's only 3.5, 4 hours from Louisville, so it's easy to get to. And that made a huge impact on me. I wasn't able to go the next year, but I did go to Bethlehem in 1985 and have been to every one since. It is both of interest to me and value to me, and it's like a family reunion, as well as some of the finest worship that I have in any given year.
Interesting. And you were also a member of the executive committee and served as president. What was that like, and what were you dealing with?
Well, of course, we had to find oil for the lamps. I'm having to click off a notice here. Hang on.
It's okay.
Okay. It was the usual challenges. How do we grow membership? How do we finance the programs that we would like to do for ourselves and for the church at large? How do we keep up with all the challenges that are present, not just in hymnology, but in church music and in the church and in the world? And so the particular incidents are not the same as today, nor are they the same as 50 years earlier, but the challenges keep coming up over and over in new forms. And I'm happy to say that I think the society in most cases has risen to the challenges.
Mm-hmm. And any particular experiences that stand out during your leadership time?
Yes, one in particular. Tom Smith decided to retire, and I didn't know when I became president that that was going to happen during my term. So we had to do a search. And Tom was the only executive director the Hymn Society had, and he was chosen by the people who reorganized the society in 1976. So here is an organization that by 95 is 70 some years old, but has never done a search for an executive director. So we had to figure out how to do it. And we did, and we found Carl Dahl. So we must have done something right.
Indeed. You know, one of the things that I've noticed about the Hymn Society that you're sort of alluding to is that unlike a lot of organizations which are sort of founded by someone who has a grand vision that they sort of engage people in, the Hymn Society seems to have sort of emerged from the bottom up, even though, you know, there were some leaders involved at the beginning. And it's been a member-driven organization more than a lot of other organizations I know. And yet, at some point, that there came a need to have staff to make it work more efficiently. Does that resonate with your own study and experience?
I think so. The society started as a small group, really as an interest group. But they realized, and Emily Perkins, who the other founders considered to be the founder, she realized within a decade that if it was going to influence people, it needed to involve people who were active in churches, pastors and church musicians, and not just those who thought about it or loved it or whatever. And so they set out to change their course to include those people. And the Hymn Society has always existed on some version of a shoestring. I remember in looking through the history, I can't tell you the year, but it was late 40s, early 50s. The treasurer reported a balance under $2, but they also agreed to take out a bank loan so they could keep doing what they were doing. And we've never been wealthy, but we have had people who have pitched in to the extent they were able, both with funds and with effort. And we are thriving in a different way than I think people thought in the early decades. But I think we are thriving.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, you have been working on this history for quite some time, and you know more about the history of the Hymn Society than I'm sure than any person ever has known. And I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on some things that you've learned that surprised you, or that that affirmed what your experience had been.
Well, I hinted at this when I gave a report at our centennial dinner. I sort of assumed, as you know, young people like us always assume, that our founders were old fuddy-duddies. Well, no. We might consider them that way, and they might have been in some ways, but they were, for the most part, progressive and for the most part, inclusive. Now, I apply those things in a different world from ours, but I was pleased to discover those sorts of things. And though we have a couple of times restated the organization's objectives, we really haven't changed them. And it is remarkable to me how you put that kind of continuity of purpose alongside the changes within and without the society. And I think the degree that we balance that is exceptional. And I think that's one of the reasons that we are who we are now.
One of the things that struck me, I did have a chance to read the first chapter of the book, and it really struck me how even early on, the leaders of the Hymn Society seemed to be extremely attentive to the social movements around them and the social demands of the gospel that they were singing about. What can you say more about that?
Well, the Hymn Society began 101 years ago now. And that came right after two or three important things in American culture and to some extent world culture. Theologically, we had the difference between the modernists and the fundamentalists. Mm-hmm. The founders of the society, to the extent they were involved at all, were mostly modernists, but they were not exclusive. They certainly included a number of people we would identify as fundamentalists. The second thing, of course, was World War I. And that had disrupted the world in many ways, but in its aftermath, it brought a great hope for peace and what they would have called brotherhood. And that was one of the emphases in their hymnody and in their goals. We know William Pearson Merrill, if at all, as the author of Rise Up, O Men of God. He was also one of the most prominent pacifists in the country and found himself in trouble and at every level because of his position on that. And then the third thing was the pandemic. Well, we know a little bit about pandemics now, but in the aftermath of the flu, combining their social gospel and peace interests, they were really interested in what will serve the churches, what will help the churches become involved in ministries that serve the time they were living in. And that's been repeatedly true. In the 40s, we can go back and we see that one of the papers was a collection of patriotic hymns. But they weren't patriotic hymns like the first things that spring to our mind. They had a long discussion and wrote very careful criteria for hymns that would contribute to world peace and to not a muting of the Christian message, but a hearing of other messages. It's really remarkable to me as I got familiar with this history that I didn't know.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of blew me away, to be honest with you, because like you say, I just sort of assumed that they were of a different mindset. And it sort of heartened me to know that there's a great continuity in spirit, if not in actual expressions along the way, that what we're experiencing today and what we're reaching for today is consistent with the vision of the founders with respect to our place in society and in the world. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about it. We talked about supporting the Hymn Society when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, and I know that you had mentioned that there's something you wanted to perhaps communicate as part of our time today.
Well, we continue to need the people and the money to enable what the people do. Uh, and I hope people that hear us say this will not feel like they're being harassed, but it's just a fact of life. It's remarkable how much the Hymn Society has accomplished with so little. Uh, but we could always do more if we had more. Uh, I don't know exactly what that will be. It will take the next generations to figure that out. But what we can do to support them is to invest time and money to enable their visions.
Right. It occurs to me that one of the ways that the Hymn Society has traditionally done that is by providing ways for people to develop and strengthen relationships. Through that's certainly one of the main features of the conference is bringing together the exact kinds of people you were talking about before, that the founders realized they needed to include pastors and other people who were part of the agenda in singing together. And I think the Hymn Society has continued to do that through the conferences. And as time goes on, we're looking for new ways to do that. And because the world is changing, and we can't rely just on the conference to do that. So what you're saying makes sense to me.
Well, I think we've been successful because of three things that were to some degree intentional. One is we've never been a purely professional society. There are those of us who go digging through archives and old books and things, but there are practitioners of all kinds, and there are people who just love hymn singing and love what we do. So the breadth of the membership is one important thing. Another kind of breadth is the theological and denominational diversity. I have valued that so much with people whom I have a lot in common and a little in common. And the fact that it is not primarily theological or denominational gets a lot of those issues out of the way. Not that they don't come up in conversation, but they come up with appreciation of what other people are doing in other contexts and a kind of greater understanding. And then the third kind of breadth is certainly the cultural breadth. Mm-hmm. We tend to think that is new, but it isn't. Again, through much of our history, the mostly white, mostly upper class, mostly male members of the society have been interested and active in learning about other ways of doing things. One of the earliest meetings in the 1920s had two visitors, one a missionary in Russia, and one a missionary in the then exotic country of Hawaii, and talking about translating materials to and from those languages. And the kind of question that we hear in our conversation, well, to what extent is this popular American church music affecting you? I had no idea they had those conversations, but they did. And I don't know that we've always been good at it, but we've always tried to get better at it. And I see a great promise in what we are accomplishing now.
Yeah. Well, it sort of goes to some questions just need to keep being asked, right?
Yes.
And that's what we do. I'm wondering if there's anything that I didn't ask yet that you were hoping we would talk about.
Well, I could talk about lots of people, but that might not be what they want. The title, the subtitle of the history is A Calling and a Community. And I think it has been that for most of us. We have various different callings that overlap in the area of congregational song. But the community that we have, both when we're able to be together and when we're able, when we must be apart and communicate by email or Zoom webinar or whatever, it is just wonderful to me. I will mention two people who I consider among the saints of the Hymn Society, and those are Austin Lovelace and Bob Battistini. And the reason they come up is not just because of all the things they did for the society and for me, but I have a very fond memory of an Epiphany service done at a conference in which someone had the brilliant idea that Austin and Bob and I should be the three wise men. Now, I don't know that this added to anyone's understanding of the biblical story, but I felt really good to be with those guys.
You certainly were in great company.
Yes.
I have to say, for me too, Bob has been probably one of the greatest influences in terms of my association with the Hymn Society, but also just in as a church musician. He's been sort of one of my models and heroes over the years.
He knows where the good restaurants are too.
That too. I've learned a lot about food and wine as well over the years, which is great. We only have one question so far, so if people want to chime in with other questions, please do so. But I'm going to go back to this from John Kleinhexel, who said, you compiled a songbook for Sanford that had a hymn in it from Mel Bringle with his tune, and you had sent him a complimentary copy. Years later, he asked you if the songbook caught on at Sanford, celebrated being called to follow Jesus. You said, nope. Say more about what the music life was like at Sanford during that time.
I'll have to recollect it some. This was in the early 2000s when Sanford had a grant from the Lilly Foundation on faith, vocation, and learning. And I proposed, and it was approved, that we compile a resource for worship. It was mostly hymns, though it included other liturgical materials as well as some devotional readings that dealt with various aspects of faith, vocation, and learning. This is on a campus which had semi-required chapel. What I mean by that is there was a twice-a-week convocation, which was a mix of lectures and worship and other presentations. Worship was not liturgically structured. The popular Christian music on the campus was not what was done in a chapel with a pipe organ. The collection I put together included a wide variety of things, including other languages and cultures and some guitar chords and things like that. But it was never the vision of anyone leading worship in either of the chapels on campus, either the University Chapel or the Divinity School Chapel, to make use of that book. So it is another one of the rare books I have produced.
Well, you've been involved with quite a number of books over the years, but
nearly all of them rare, yes.
Well, that seems appropriate. So I've asked everyone in this series the same question at the end, and I'd like to put this one to you. What would be your fond hope for the Hymn Society going forward?
I think that the people who are coming into leadership and already in leadership will continue to pursue the common goals, but with the appropriate adaptation to culture and theology and society. And I can't begin to prescribe what they should do because I don't know. I think that those who are guiding the church by leading its worship face issues and problems that are different from what I was prepared to consider. I hope they will face them with wisdom and discernment. Uh, they will be challenged to put their principles into their context. And I suppose that's really what ministry is, no matter what role you're in. Uh, I often wonder, what is the liturgical role of what we sing? Is it integral? Is it accompanying? How is it shaped by context? I think of Lathrop's juxtaposition of these issues. I think of the necessity of cultural adaptation, but in the time I've been teaching, and certainly today, the dominant culture is, I think, an artificial culture. And what I mean by that is it doesn't have many of the characteristics of traditional cultures. I'm not equipped to deal with that. I hope, and I hope in the best sense, that people will be prepared to deal with that and to serve well while doing it. When we talked a while back, I mentioned a phrase that I heard Don Husted say dozens of times, and I think it's only recently that I've really begun to capture what he meant by it. He said that music and worship should live up to that group's theology. I think what he was saying was that it's not so much a cultural issue as it is a theological issue, and how we employ music to express our belief not only in worship but in ministry to the communities around us. So I'm still learning, and I look forward to learning to people who are actively involved in this study. And I certainly wish them well as they use congregational song in their ministry.
Well said, Paul. It's certainly we keep change continues, right? But our foundations remain. And I thank you for everything that you've done to lead us to this point.
Well, I have enjoyed almost all of
it. And so have we. Well, thank you so much for this time together. I think sounds from the comments, I can tell people have really enjoyed being with you today, and I have too. So thanks for that. And,
well, every one of those people should, for favorable comments, make a contribution to the Hymn Society.
Amen to that. Just to let everyone know, we were supposed to have an interview with Alice Parker back in October, but she had an accident that precluded her ability to do that. But we've rescheduled it for February the 10th. Not the 10th. It's the second Monday of February, and February the 13th. And so we'll be announcing that through the stanza. But that means we'll be having two interviews in February 13th with Alice Parker, and then February 27th with Jorge Lockwood. So stay tuned. We'll be continuing to do this, and I appreciate everyone's good feedback on this. We've been getting such good feedback. I think we'll probably continue this into another season. There are lots more interesting people to talk to in this society. So thanks for that, Paul. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Thanks for being with us.